Hi everyone, welcome to the RX Teach Happy Hour. My name is Brenton Wolf, I'm a PharmD, and today we're going to be talking about one of my favorite topics, and that is the metabolic benefits of Zone 2 training. As always, this is a happy hour. Today's drink is the Russell's 10 Reserve, which is one of my go-to drinks these days. To me, on the nose, it has a very butterscotch type of scent, which I love. Brings me back to like those hard candies you used to get at Grandma and Grandpa's house. First sip of the day, first sip of the happy hour. Hope you're ready to learn something, and cheers to you. So good. So Zone 2 training is a very big topic. It's one that's very close to my heart. It's something that I've more recently discovered, have definitely put it into my training regimen as much as I possibly can these days. There's so many benefits to Zone 2 training that I'm not going to get into today, but what I'm going to focus on is the metabolic benefits. So we're really going to dive deep into the cellular process behind Zone 2, what Zone 2 training technically is from a biomarker standpoint, what it means from a fuel source perspective, what it means from a metabolic flexibility perspective, what kind of training is associated with Zone 2. We're going to dig into a couple of papers like the sources of fuel when you're in Zone 2 compares to Zone 1 and then 3 through 5, along with what kind of Zone 2 training capabilities depending on your fitness level, your athletic status. Are you an elite athlete? Are you an everyday Joe like myself? Are you just getting into exercise and you don't even know what Zone 2 is yet, which is totally fine. We're going to talk about all of that stuff today, and I'm very excited. So I tend to say that Zone 2 training is really the deadlift of the endurance world. And what I mean by that, if you're familiar at all with powerlifting, strongman competitions, you know that a deadlift is a quintessential lift to all of those folks. That and the back squat and of course the bench press tend to come up the most when it comes to heavy lifting, but Zone 2 training is really the endurance world equivalent of those three lifts because it just gives you so much benefit. It's core to building an aerobic base and is therefore critical to many different types of endurance training. A lot of the most famous athletes in the world are endurance athletes, although like things like cycling aren't that big in the United States. Globally, it's a huge sport, and people in those areas are going to be spending 80% or so of their training in Zone 2. So it's absolutely a critical zone to understand, both for you as a healthcare provider and also for all of your patients. And at some point we will be making videos about how to prescribe aerobic capacity training, including Zone 2 and VO2 max regimens to your patients. But today, like I said, we're going to dive deep into the cellular level and see what's really going on. So let's actually define Zone 2. And although most of the stuff you're going to see on the internet and most explanations of Zone 2 are going to be based off of heart rate, the real definition of Zone 2 is based off of a lactate level. So the technical definition of Zone 2 is the highest metabolic output you can sustain while keeping your lactate levels below 2 millimoles per liter. Now, despite the fact that that is the technical definition, again, most people, unless you're like an elite athlete such as an Olympic swimmer or something, aren't taking the time to measure their lactate levels mid-activity. You're not going to stick yourself and take a blood level. Whereas most of your athletes in the world today, whether you're a marathon runner or just a hobbyist, are going to be basing their Zone 2 off of heart rate. And to be in Zone 2 means that your heart rate is somewhere in between 70 and 80% of your maximum heart rate. Hopefully you're getting a max heart rate based off of something you've actually seen, so you're actually out there measuring your heart rate on a run or a swim or a bike, and your max heart rate is literally the highest number you've ever seen your heart get up to via strenuous exercise. Although you can also calculate a max heart rate using various formulas. The one we're going to talk about today is the Maffetone formula. So again, if you're going to calculate your max heart rate, you essentially take 220 minus your current age, and that would be your estimated max heart rate. So for me, if I'm 26 years old, I take 220 minus 26, and my estimated max heart rate would be 194 beats per minute. So to calculate my Zone 2 based off of my max heart rate, I would take 70% and 80% of that 194. That gives me a range of 136 to 155 beats per minute, and that is when I know via heart rate monitor, hopefully a chest strap rather than a watch, that I am in Zone 2. I mentioned earlier the Maffetone formula, and that is when you take your age from 180. So 180 minus 26, and that would be your quote-unquote max aerobic heart rate. In other words, that's the top end of your Zone 2 heart rate. For me, 180 20 minus 26 again gives me a number of 154, so it's very similar to that other formula we talked about, but it's not going to give you a range. Again, it's giving you your max aerobic heart rate, so the top end of zone 2. You should know that these formulas are not necessarily that accurate. That's why it's always better to use real world data if you can and your actual numbers, just because there are plenty of exceptions to this. You can actually become an exception yourself with training, depending on your genetics and your background. For instance, someone like Lance Armstrong could hold a max heart rate that is 30% higher than what these formulas are going to predict, both for their max heart rate and for their zone 2 training heart rate. So take all of those numbers with a grain of salt. Use it as a starting point. You're going to have to use your own data to figure out when you're in zone 2 based off of your current heart rate and really the exertion that you are feeling. And when I speak about exertion, that is actually the most common and the best way, I would say, if you're not looking to spend any money or you're not really interested in tracking the numbers that tightly, of determining whether or not you're in zone 2. And what I mean by that is you can go off of perceived exertion. So if I'm on a run and I'm, let's say, running with a buddy, I should be able to speak with him while I'm running if I'm going to be in zone 2. It's not going to be a super clear conversation the way I'm speaking right now. For instance, if I was on the phone with someone and I was training in zone 2, you would be able to tell that I'm exercising, right? Like, you're not so calm and your heart rate's not so low that there's no exertion perceived by the people around you, but rather I should be able to have a long conversation with someone, maybe having to occasionally pause while I'm speaking in order to catch my breath, but I should not be running or biking fast enough to where I literally am too tired or breathing too quickly to actually speak or hold a conversation with someone. If you can't speak in full sentences and potentially even in paragraphs, you're likely at a zone 3 or higher heart rate and not in that zone 2. So your ability to train in zone 2 is going to be highly dependent on your metabolic flexibility. For instance, if you are, let's say, very out of shape or you have type 2 diabetes, it might be very difficult for you to actually sustain a zone 2 effort without creeping into that zone 3 through 5. There's nothing wrong with that. That's something that you can overcome with time and training, so don't worry about it. But just so you know, from a metabolic standpoint, from a cellular process standpoint, your metabolic flexibility is going to very much determine what your zone 2 range and capability actually looks like. What that generally comes down to is your baseline lactate level. So again, the technical definition of zone 2 training is a metabolic output where your lactate is below 2 millimoles per liter. However, resting lactate levels in someone with metabolic disease or diabetes, whatever it might be, they can actually hover around 2, sometimes even over 2, and for that reason, it might be very difficult for you to maintain a zone 2 effort. Outside of the lactate conversation, there's a whole conversation you have to have about fuels, at least from a cellular perspective. And I keep saying cellular, and of course, luckily today we're speaking about everyone's favorite organelle, and that is the mitochondria, what everyone knows as the powerhouse of the cell.
Really? Powerhouse? Oh.
And in this case, the powerhouse of the cell has 3 fuels that they can use very readily. Those 3 fuels are going to be glucose, fatty acids, and lactate. First off, when it comes to mitochondria, the number of mitochondria and the flexibility of those mitochondria are incredibly important from a cellular perspective and from just a health and longevity perspective. And we'll talk about those more in later videos, but just understand that if you can have more mitochondria, that's literally a good thing. Remember that in that mitochondria, both lipids and fatty acids are oxidized. Not one or the other, but it's capable of doing both. So to be metabolically flexible means that you can take, for instance, a fatty acid and rely on fatty acids as a fuel source for a longer period of time before your mitochondria have to flip to oxidizing glucose. On the other hand, if you're metabolically inflexible, that means that your mitochondria's ability to oxidize fatty acids for energy is close to 0. And therefore, rather than staying in zone 2, your mitochondria are going to flip and start oxidizing glucose faster. The other part of that is lactate, right? So if you're metabolically inflexible, not only do you have that fuel change, but also your lactate levels are going to rise earlier and faster than someone who is metabolically flexible. That's that lactic acid building up from lactate and why you might be sore the next day. So if you haven't put that together yet, zone 2 training, because it increases our metabolic flexibility, actually also increases our ability to metabolize fatty acids in place of glucose for a longer period of time. So you will hear frequently that burning fat is best done in zone 2, just because from a percentage perspective, a lot of your calories are coming from fat in comparison to carbohydrates. I put a big star and asterisk on that statement because higher output levels, although you might switch from fatty acid oxidation to glucose oxidation, you're also burning more calories in general because your heart rate's going to be higher, you're going to be breathing heavier, that kind of thing. You're actually spending more energy, even if from a percentage breakdown, less of it is coming from fat. It's not that fat burning is always best in zone 2, because from a total calories spent perspective, if you're going to spend 1 hour in zone 2 or 1 hour in zone 4, you're going to burn more calories in zone 4. Absolutely. So it's important to understand the tie between glucose, fatty acids, and lactate. So again, someone with diabetes, for instance, might have lactate levels that are high. And it just so happens that lactic acidosis also hinders your ability to utilize fatty acids. And so those things are going to push each other in different directions. I'll put a graph here now that really shows, I think, the relationship between glucose, lactate, and fatty acids. And hopefully that helps you understand the relationship between all of those things. So again, when it comes down to athletic prowess and ability, extreme athletes are able to maintain zone 2 training levels and heart rate levels at much higher energy outputs. The thing about it is elite athletes are very metabolically flexible, and therefore they're able to clear lactate at an incredible rate. So rather than their lactate skyrocketing from 2 to 4 when they're going at 300 watts for 30 minutes, which might be the case for an average Joe, their lactate levels just refuse to get over 2, despite the fact that they are cruising along at a massive speed. And that's one of the things I haven't talked about yet. Lactate clearance is essential to, one, preventing lactic acidosis and being sore the next day, but also just to staying in zone 2 because of that relationship between lactate, fatty acids, and carbohydrate oxidation. So there are really 4 main factors why someone who's not super healthy or not super fit might have problems staying in zone 2. Increased baseline lactate levels, decreased lactate clearance, decreased fatty acid oxidation, and increased carbohydrate oxidation, all happening in the mitochondria. So remember, lactate and fat oxidation are inversely related. Lactate and carbohydrate oxidation are directly related. Lactate and exercise effort are also directly related, meaning the harder you exercise, the higher your lactate level is going to go. And then fat oxidation and carbohydrate oxidation are also inversely related. So again, in zone 2, you're going to have more fatty acid oxidation compared to carbohydrate oxidation, but then in zone 5, that's going to flip, where you're going to have more carbohydrate oxidation and less fatty acid oxidation. The big metabolic benefit of zone 2 training is that it optimizes fat oxidation over carbohydrate oxidation. The fitter you are, the more power you can actually output, whether you're running, cycling, swimming, and also maintain that zone 2 level, both from a lactate perspective and a heart rate perspective, and therefore a perceived exertion perspective. One of the reasons you see zone 2 recommendations being over 1 or 2 hours, or maybe even longer depending on what you're training for. If you're training for a marathon, for instance, a 20-mile run might go longer than 2 hours. It's partially because in order to get that caloric consumption that would be equivalent to doing some kind of HIIT cardio or some zone 4 or 5 cardio for a shorter amount of time, you have to do zone 2 training longer, because again, your heart rate is low and your metabolic expenditure is actually low, but the key is the ratio between carbohydrates and fat. I also want to make it clear that although zone 2 is fantastic, this does not mean you should be avoiding training in zones 3 through 5. There's a whole nother aspect of aerobic capacity called VO2 max, and in order to train VO2 max, you certainly have to exceed zone 2. Generally speaking, as I've said before, you're going to spend about 80% of your time in zone 2 and then 20% of your time training VO2 max. So those other heart rate zones are absolutely important. They're just not the focus of today's video, but we will cover them later. So I've talked about biomarkers, I've talked about fats and carbohydrates and lactate, and you might be sitting here wondering, like, who the hell cares? Well, it all comes down to metabolic flexibility, because to be metabolically flexible is what is preventing chronic disease. If you want to avoid diabetes, if you want to feel like you can go on long hikes in your 60s and 70s, you have to spend time not only in zone 2, but also training your VO2 max. But most importantly, you have to have that metabolic flexibility. Metabolic disease is one of the main causes of death in the United States, and I can't stress that enough. So please target metabolic flexibility training, whether that's zone 2, VO2 max, hopefully everything. And remember that metabolic disease is also a huge risk factor for other terrible diseases like Alzheimer's, cancer, and cardiovascular disease. So if you want to decrease your risk of suffering from any of those things, again, you should be hyper focused on metabolic flexibility and therefore hyper focused on aerobic capacity training, including zone 2 and VO2 max. That is to say that metabolic flexibility is very protective, not only from an all-cause mortality point of view, which we've shown in other papers and in other videos, but specifically when you're talking about cardiovascular disease and other diseases associated with metabolic syndrome. So I hope you learned something today. I hope you understand the metabolic benefits of zone 2 training. Again, we're going to talk about how to actually train in zone 2, how to prescribe zone 2 training regimens to your patients, but all of that is going to be in a separate happy hour, a different whiskey on that day as well. But until then, again, I hope you learned something, and cheers to you.